All right, hi, welcome to Unsiloing Your Project Team with Collaborative Sketching and Digital Prototyping. I'm Kat Kuhl, and this is Michelle Chin. We both work for a small firm in DC that works primarily on federal government clients as well as some private and nonprofit projects. And we put this presentation together primarily for three audiences that can really benefit from adopting this sketching and prototyping approach that we've started taking at Rock Creek. Now, part of the reason why we put this together was that previously we had been pretty wireframe exclusive. The way that we did our user experience work was by going through a series of wireframing exercises up front after the discovery phase and the sitemap phase that could run as many as 30 wireframes or as few as 5, depending on the needs of the client. And we found that we were having some pretty severe challenges with this after a while. So we put this together for UXers and designers who might be having trouble getting their team engaged with this broader user experience process. For developers who can be frustrated by having little input in the project until it comes time to actually build something out. And for project managers who benefit from having more informed buy-in from clients at the point of approval and making sure that they're really engaged with what's going on. So when we talk about the challenges of this wireframing approach, just to make sure we're all on the same page about what we're referring to as what is traditional, it's usually where the user experience strategist, in this case, Michelle, talks to the client a lot about what their needs are and what they want from this project, what their goals are, who their audience is, conducts stakeholder interviews, focus group processes, and then really distills all of this down to a sitemap and a series of wireframes. And as I mentioned, we've had a wide range about how many of these wireframes end up being necessary. Now then, she'll give these to the designer, who will make really pretty comps for it. And then ultimately the designer will give that to the developer, who will have to build all of this out. So the first problem we had with this is that there are a lot of handoffs during this process. The user experience strategist hands it off to the designer, hands it off to the developer. Prior to that, you may have a content strategist involved who's really working with the user experience strategist and handing that off as well. And then the project manager, hopefully, is connected the entire way through, but few other people are, and a lot can get lost in the miscommunication. The second problem is that there are lots of revisions. If you've ever had to produce a lot of wireframes for a project, you know that oftentimes your client is going to raise questions not just about the nature of the elements in the hierarchy on the wireframe, but also about the text on the wireframe. You're going to have to go back and make revisions periodically to probably all of the wireframes, occasionally only a few, because it can be hard to keep focus on just the things that are the most important. Creating those revisions can be really time-consuming, and it can eat into your timeline, especially when the client has to review each revision round, and that's built into your contract. The last thing is kind of a natural result of the first two. If you have a lot of people jumping in and out of the project at different points, people are going to be not necessarily engaged all the way through. So if I'm the developer on the project and I'm just getting it when the UXer and the designer have really done the heavy lifting and the thinking, it can be challenging for me to understand why I'm building that out, especially if I know that there's a much simpler way to do things that could be implemented here instead. So as the director of technology at Rock Creek, I supervise the development team, and probably our biggest challenge with it is what happens to our timeline. We wind up having a relatively small amount of time to build out what can be some fairly complex designs and user experience things. We also have fairly little time to remediate the accessibility, which is a big priority for us working on federal government contracts. And we're cramming a lot into this phase that doesn't necessarily have to be there. The migration component in particular can be really problematic if you're looking at a large site. The second challenge that we have, as on the development side of things at least, is hearing your UXer or your designer say, oh, but now that I see it, I want to change something, once they actually see how it looks in practice. And as developers, it can be easy to get frustrated with this, but there are very legitimate reasons for this happening. Your UXer has a certain set of assumptions, your designer has others, your client certainly has others, and all these come together at the development phase. unless they're very, very heavily annotated in your wireframes, which we'll talk about later. So I see people building out fairly complex responsive designs and then getting horrified by how it looks on phablet because they've never thought about phablet before. Or accessibility analysts giving the feedback that this interaction they had earlier thought was really going to be accessible to people using a keyboard turns out not to be. Or just anyone looking at animation ever is going to think that it was going to behave a little bit differently than it does in practice.
So I'll talk a little bit about the UX challenges that the UXers at Rock Creek were facing originally when we did this siloed approach. So we'd be designing wireframes in a vacuum, and what that means is that I'd go back to my desk and I'd have to wireframe out quite a bit before I could show my concept to a developer to say, hey, is this okay? So it was quite a bit of work to just run an idea by somebody. In addition, our team would create pretty high fidelity wireframes. So, we have to include the interactions and what things would look like and what stuff would be placed where. And that also meant updating them. So if I designed something pretty complicated and a developer told me that's going to be really impossible to do with a timeline, I would have to go back and fix it. And that was a lot of work. In addition, we make a lot of annotations because these wireframes are paper-based and static. They're not showing any level of interactivity. So I'll have to do all these little call-outs to talk about everything that's supposed to happen. So what happens when you tap on this feature or you click this or you use a mobile device. And that also left some misinterpretations. So developers might interpret something that I said one way or implement it differently, and we would get our wires crossed. And that was a little frustrating for everybody.
So accessibility, as I mentioned, is a priority for people in the federal government. How many people in the room are familiar with accessibility needs on a web development project? Okay, cool. So just about everyone. Just in case, accessibility is when we're trying to make sure that the site can be accessed by anyone, regardless of any physical disabilities they may have. So if you are blind and use a screen reader, or if you even have visual impairments and use a screen reader, you should still be able to interact with the site the same way. If you can't use a mouse, you should be able to tab through it with your keyboard. And this is actually a requirement for any federal government projects, which is primarily our space, so it's a big deal for us. If you are trying to assess wireframes up front to see if they're going to give you problems, it's a lot harder to do if you're looking at a wireframe. So you might say as an accessibility analyst, yeah, it's a map, it's probably going to work okay, just watch out for a few things. But in practice, the Drupal module the developer selects, the theming that gets done, all of these things contribute to how accessible this is actually going to be.
So in terms of a designer, there are some challenges in doing the siloed approach. So, the UXer, I would design these wireframes, and then I would pass them along to design for review. And they would have to do a lot of catch-up. They'd have to ask me, well, what about this, or why was this decision made? How come the functionality is like this? Is this something that the client wanted? So they would spend a lot of time ramping up and figuring out what was going on. And not only that, it was just more difficult to get buy-in from team members. So they would take my wireframes, interpret it, create a design, and then have to explain it to the rest of the team, the reasons for developing or designing the functionality the way they did, or designing other features, and rather than focusing on the vision. So after going through this approach a couple times, we were thinking, well, maybe there's something that could be a little bit better. What is something that could help us out and make us be more productive and transition smoothly? So we were thinking that something, easier to understand would be great. And even something quicker to iterate upon, so we're not wasting a lot of time making changes. And something more realistic and tangible than just paper static wireframes. And something that involves everyone earlier, so not everyone's having to play catch up. And for us, the solution ended up being collaborative sketching and digital prototyping. So with collaborative sketching, that got everyone on board early on in the project, and through that we carried it to digital prototyping, which created something that was easy to understand and very realistic. So we'll talk a little bit about how we got the collaborative sketching process started, as well as the digital prototyping process at Rock Creek. First off, we had to make the change. Shifting to a change with collaboration, we picked a small project. And we definitely recommend picking a small project because it's less risky. You don't want to take a huge project that's going to, take several months and be a lot of effort in terms of pages and migration. Something small, something manageable in size. Because if this approach doesn't work at your team, then it's quicker to recover. You still have enough time to manage a small project. In addition, you want to get buy-in from your teammates. So what I did when we shifted to this approach, I went to every one of my teammates and I asked, hey, is this something you'd like to try? Can we try the sketching approach? It might be easier for you. We might be able to talk about some ideas and, get somewhere faster. And believe it or not, everyone that I asked had said yes. Even the people who, I thought would definitely say no. They were like, yeah, let's try it. So you also want to involve the right people. And who do you want to involve? And that's actually everyone. So for this collaborative process, we involve the UXers, the developers of both the front and the back end developers, so the designers, accessibility analysts, the content strategists, and even the project managers. So when you do this paradigm shift, you want to set expectations. You want to know that sketching is going to lead to a prototype and not just your traditional siloed approach of wireframes passed on to designer to the developer. And that this could make your life easier. Perhaps this is a new approach that you're taking on, and we knew we were going in uncharted waters, but we were all excited about it. So we knew it was going to be bumpy, and we were willing to try it because we were willing to make things better. So how do we sketch collaboratively? We'll go over the basics of how to sketch, when to sketch, what you need to sketch, and how to facilitate the discussion sessions to make this pretty productive. In terms of what you'll need, we're literally sketching. So markers, paper, 8.5 by 11 sheets, 11 by 17, masking tape to hang up your designs, scissors, sticky notes. And we also make it really fun and kind of like a team building experience by providing snacks and music. And what I'll do is I'll have someone be a DJ and they'll pick a playlist or they'll make a playlist on Spotify and we'll play that. And it just gets everyone comfortable with the idea that they're going to be sketching. In terms of where we're going to sketch, this is actually where we sketch in our office. So it's one of the conference rooms with a huge whiteboard wall. And you want to pick something that's an open area that has ample wall space for hanging up your designs, and it's free from distractions. In terms of what you're going to sketch, so this is where the UXer comes in. So I'll take a sitemap and then circle all the pages in the sitemap that I think we should sketch out. And that includes main pages like your home page or any landing pages, any pages with unique functionality and features, so like galleries, data-heavy pages, and then also keep in mind sketching out responsive versions of the above. So when to sketch? The way we break it down is to a 3-part process. We'll have a pre-sketch meeting, which is about like a half an hour long, and that just goes over the basics of what to expect, what we're going to be doing, what we're sketching. And we'll have sketching sessions following that. So usually an hour and a half to 2 hours long, we'll have one sketching session. Depending on how big the project is, we might have 2, or you could have 3. And after we do the sketching, we'll do the discussing of those sketches to come up with some decisions of how we're going to approach the prototype. And those are each an hour and a half to 2 hours long. We don't make them all day. It's especially when you're trying this new approach out, smaller chunks are better. Giving some space and giving some time for people to decompress and recharge and come back fresh is always helpful. So at the pre-sketch meeting, I set expectations. And that just talks about the goals of the sketching and what we're going to sketch. And especially if you're trying this out, you're going to describe what happens in each session. So we're going to go, Monday and Wednesday, we'll have some sketching sessions. Thursday, Friday, we'll talk about it. This is also where I'll provide background information on the project. And that includes the sitemap as well as the pages that we're going to sketch. And with that list of pages, I'll include the features that should be on each page. So maybe the client has requested that the Twitter feed be on the home page. So we'll include that in the design. As well as any user research, such as personas or scenarios, or any web surveys that might have been done in the start of the project, is always helpful to include to give your team enough information about sketching. As well as previous project work. So one of the projects that we did, we had a client and we did a lot of print collateral for them and they really liked it, so they asked us to redesign their website. So I brought all that print collateral to the meeting just to show people, this is kind of the direction that this company's going and this is what they're looking for. So here we are with the sketching. So we're all sketching out different pages. Not everyone sketches out all the pages. Some people just focus on more intricate stuff. Some people focus on other things that they really want to try to tackle. And after that, we'll post a sketch to the wall. And as you can see, we've got some different ideas going on. So some tips for sketching. So encourage everyone to sketch. It might be a little intimidating for a developer or content strategist who is not good at drawing to be sitting next to a designer, and that's okay. So what we try to do is let everyone know that, you know, we're not looking for great masterpieces, but we're looking for the ideas behind it. So it's great for developers who might know of like the latest module or new module that they want to try. They can try putting that on paper. And that, remember, no idea is a bad one. So for one of our sketches, we had someone design a video gallery, which we had no budget for in terms of creating the videos and having that available. And instead, we didn't scrap her idea. We actually used parts of the functionality to implement in a photo gallery. And for the sketching sessions, you also want to pay attention to everyone's energy level. So if you scoped out a 2-hour session and people are starting to fade after 45 minutes, maybe you make the sketching session only an hour long or an hour and 15 minutes. You know, you want everyone to have a good time and you want this to be productive and you want it to be a good experience. So after we do all the sketching, we'll do some discussion. So here's a picture of everyone's sketches for different pages on the site. In terms of discussing, we'll pick a page. So maybe we'll pick like the news and events page to talk about. And we'll go over the ideas, kind of like a show and tell, like the people will stand next to their idea and say, this is what I was thinking in terms of, you know, how to lay out the stories, and then like having other blocks on the right side. And sometimes we'll go with one sketch saying, wow, this is a terrific sketch, let's go with it. But a lot of times we're also picking parts of other sketches and we'll just say, I like this feature from Kat's sketch, or I like this feature from Lauren's sketch. And so we'll kind of Frankenstein things together, which sounds a little scary. But that's where the UXer comes in. So the UXer will take their UX skills and make sure that what we're picking out is sound in terms of design and in terms of functionality. And probably one of the most important things when doing these discussion sessions is taking notes. So there's a lot of ideas being brought to the table, a lot of debate, a lot of discussion about figuring out what's feasible in the time that we have and the feasibility in terms of technology. So we do a lot of discussing, and it's really important to have someone capture what we finally decided on. So pro tips for discussion. The UXer or the project manager, it's a great time to use facilitation skills and making sure that the ideas are brought to the table and the discussion's going smoothly. And you also want to make sure everyone is heard. This is a collaborative exercise, and the reason why we're bringing everyone to the table is so everyone does have a voice. And because everyone's at the table, you can vet the ideas really easily with your teammates because they're right there. So maybe I will design something that I think would be like great for a filter, but I'm not sure if it's accessible. I can say, hey, is this accessible? And the accessibility analyst can say, yes, it is, or maybe no, we have to tweak it. And right then and there, I didn't have to completely wireframe anything out. I just asked him. So after you do the discussion, the UX designer will go back and create lo-fi reference sketches. So this, depending on the site, like sometimes I will just take some of the sketches that we did and add post-it notes and just annotate that and take that to the developer. Or I will create some really, really rough internal wireframes in OmniGraffle just to get the ideas down for the developer. And then I'll work with the developer to begin building the actual prototype.
So this is where the development team comes back in and things start, at least for me, getting a bit interesting. But the thing that we have to keep in mind before we start the development is that it's not that wireframes are inappropriate to use. It's more that wireframes are a communication tool that should be used at certain times and not at others. So for example, we had a project recently where we ended up wireframing out about 30 pages, and we had plenty of internal changes and revisions to them, some requested by the client and some requested internally. And we found that making all those changes to those internal pages was not a good use of anyone's time. In contrast, doing the home page, which is a page that usually has a lot of opinions on the client side, a lot of opinions internally, and it's just a really high visibility page. It's a very good idea to have a wireframe of that to share with the client to say, hey, do we have the major elements you care about captured on this in this wireframe? But one thing that I like to keep in mind is this quote from Brad Frost in a recent blog post. He pointed out that when PDFs, JPEGs, and other static artifacts get thrown around, you're kind of forgetting what it is that you're designing for. So ultimately, no matter how well thought out your wireframe is, no matter how beautiful your comp is, you're not actually designing for those mediums. You're designing for a website that's going to respond when people resize their browser. It's going to respond when people hover over the menu, when people tap on mobile, maybe when people double tap on mobile. And you want to make sure that you're planning those interactions, not just looking at how things might get laid out on the page. So assuming that you've decided that you have something you need to build out and you're not going to use a wireframe, you're interested in doing a prototype, you have two major options. One option is the HTML prototype, and another option is the Drupal prototype. HTML prototypes can be attractive because they're very quick to build. Anyone who has a fairly decent knowledge of HTML and CSS can put one of these together. And it doesn't take a lot of time to get it in the shape you want to get it in. The trouble with them is that they are throwaway code. All the time that you're about to spend building this HTML prototype is not going to benefit you later in your project any more than having a wireframe would, unless you're trying to reuse it in your theme, which is tricky for a wide variety of reasons. What has really gotten to us in the past is that it's time-consuming to modify content. I think I've gone into that sufficiently. So this has the same basic challenge as it does with wireframes. This is an example of one of the ones that I was mentioning earlier. We ended up doing the wireframes and then doing some HTML prototypes for usability testing. And as you can see, there are featured news releases on the left. There are featured events on the right. There are more on the home page. There are more on certain internal pages where news releases are going to get featured in the right sidebar. And if you make a change to, say, how your date structure is, you're going to make that change in a lot of different places. That's why we've moved recently to Drupal prototyping. It is slower to build. If you want to build a Drupal prototype, it's a bit like building the beginnings of a Drupal site. It is a little bit slower, and you have to spend a lot more time on your logic, and you do have to know what you're doing in Drupal. However, with one Drupal prototype that we had done recently, we went from an HTML prototype to a Drupal prototype in the span of about an 8-hour workday. They don't have to be terribly time-consuming if you've already thought out what it is you're going to be putting in them. Fortunately, Drupal prototypes are built on top of a content management system. So if you want to modify your content later, congratulations, that's exactly what they're built for. It's also the groundwork for your site. So you're not going to throw this away when you're done with it. If you're building a Drupal prototype appropriately, then you'll prototype it out, show it to your client, get sign-off on the major visual elements, and then take it back and start content migration, or even start some of your back-end development work. So the top timeline is the one that I originally showed that had development kind of scrunched toward the back. The new timeline is the one that we're operating on now. Our prototype phase lasts longer than our original wireframing phase. But when we emerge from it, we've already done the major site building, the major module installation, I should say, and we've started the migration process to make sure that all these content types are appropriate. That means that while our design team is working on building out great comps, our migration team's already gotten a head start on anything from scripted migration to manual migration, and we're able to continue with some of that module development, accessibility analysis, because we're looking at something that's going to wind up in our final product. So if you are sold and you want to create a Drupal prototype, this is how you're going to do it. Much like a Drupal site, you're going to section it up into 3 major areas: front-end tasks, site-building tasks, and content migration. You'll notice that back-end development is not on this list because if you're doing module development for a quick prototype, you are probably doing it wrong. Your front-end tasks at this point are really minimal because you're not trying to really customize the look and feel of your prototype. It's the same goal as it is for wireframes. Get something quick in front of the client to let them react to your elements and your hierarchy, and then you're going to do the heavy lifting for how that should look later in the design phase. We like to just install a prototype theme. I think we've been using Bootstrap primarily lately, which does have its issues, but that's why we're not putting it in our final product. And we have found in the past some people have been interested in using like Zen, for example, and checking off the box that lets you outline your elements. We found that this really scares clients because if you're looking at Times New Roman with some borders around it, they tend to have a harder time processing information because it looks ugly, frankly. So at this time, your front-end developer should be working with your designer and your UXer to figure out your source order and your positioning. What I mean by that is that when you're looking at something on a desktop, you probably have a pretty good idea of what you're going for. But as you shrink it down to tablet, is your right sidebar going to stay on the right? Is your left sidebar going to stay on the left? Or are some of them going to drop down underneath the content? On mobile, is your left sidebar going to stay above your content, or is it going to drop down? Oftentimes, we've had designs where the tablet's going to end up with a right sidebar, but not a left one, and parts of the elements are going to drop below the content in a way that's consistent across the entire site. There's nothing wrong with this as long as you're planning for it. And considering it now allows you to build out your regions so you can figure out where your blocks are ultimately going to go. During this part of the project, you do need to spend some time thinking about the mobile experience, because the goal of this prototype should also be to demonstrate some responsive functionality to your audience. And if they can't get a good sense of what the mobile menu is going to look like, you might want to consider switching prototype themes or sinking a little bit of work into things there. Site building tasks are going to take up more of your time. The first task that I like to start with when I'm doing a Drupal prototype is building out the menus based on the sitemap. So if you've been building out menus in Drupal for a while, usually you have to have your content migrated into the system in order to set these up, or you have to make every link in your sitemap go to front or something similar, which is not awesome. I prefer a module called special menu items that will let you place non-linked items into your menu so you can go back and replace them later with real content. And since they're not linked, it's very easy to find them and see what you haven't done yet. As you're starting to build this out, you should also be working on your content types, your taxonomies, and your views. So, for example, if you're going to, you're going to have a big news release section. You'll set up your news release content type, work with your UXer to figure out what your broad taxonomies are, and if they've already done all the taxonomy work up front, fantastic, plug those terms in. And if not, establish your major vocabularies and put in some sample terms to give the client a sense of how taxonomy is going to work on the site. You'll also build your views. So if your news releases are going to get reused on the home page, you want to build out that view block, build out your view landing page, figure out what your featured news releases might look like. As you're building out your content types, you want to set up the aliases or SEO-friendly URLs and the breadcrumbs. This has been surprisingly important during this phase because it helps to catch logic errors in sitemaps. I have seen some user experience wireframe sitemap deliverables that have had, for example, one section for past meetings and one section for upcoming meetings. In Drupal, your content type has one set of aliases, one set of breadcrumbs. So if you're supposed to be having this information change as the event passes, this is where you're going to notice that something's wrong. Another site building task that you're going to be doing is setting up your blocks so that they appear on the right sections of your prototype. This can be done with the core blocks module, but I personally have really liked using context for it because the associations are more persistent. So when we move from the Drupal prototype into the actual Drupal development, we're going to wind up switching themes, unless you intend to use Bootstrap on your production site. And that means that when you switch themes, you don't want to lose all your blocks, which the core blocks module will do. Using something like context makes them stick around as long as they're still assigned to the same regions. Finally, during site building tasks, you are going to be installing modules to provide complex functionality. Some of them are always going to be on your sites, like views, and others are going to be pretty unique to what it is that you're doing. So during this time, I tend to install modules to give myself the functionality that I want, but I know that it's okay during this phase to use an alpha, beta, occasionally even a dev module, as long as I'm flagging it for removal later, because you don't want this ending up in your final product. So an example of using a module temporarily with the intention to go back and take it out was when we were going to build a calendar module based on the jQuery library Calendario. We didn't want to sink a bunch of time into how exactly this was going to work in our prototype phase. We just wanted to demonstrate what we were going for with the calendar. So we used Vue's calendar and then later went back and replaced it when we had more time and the concept was approved. To that point, keep in mind that you're not working with a throwaway product anymore, and that means you have to get rid of things you don't need. This ranges from those alpha and beta modules you threw in there to the field that you put on the content type, but then later decided you didn't need and were going to go back and take out, but never did. When you move from your prototype phase to your actual development phase, you really have to give yourself a time in your calendar to go through and take out the things that you don't need in order to prevent your production site from winding up cluttered. This approach really only works well if you're migrating content as you go. So we personally stay away from lorem ipsum as much as we can. We stay away from sample text as much as we can. And if we're going to demonstrate how upcoming events or featured press releases might work, we're much more likely to pull the latest ones from the client's production site, their current production site, to put in our prototype than we are to kind of make something up just to show what a news release title might look like. This gets much, much better buy-in from your clients because they start thinking about how they can use the site, what they might put in that featured area, what kind of tasks they're going to wind up doing with the CMS once they have it. If you do have to migrate any lorem ipsum text to highlight something like a new feature the client's going to have on this site that they didn't have on their old one, make sure you're building in a way to flag that for easy removal later. I like to use a Boolean checkbox on the content types that you can just check off if it is test or lorem ipsum content, and that way I always have an easy way to go back and get rid of it. So this is an example of a prototype that we did. It looks much, much more designed out than your average prototype and is clearly not in Bootstrap. This is because this prototype was being done in a site that was reusing a theme we'd already done for a production site. And this is an example of catching those logic errors and having conversations with your client early that prototypes let you do. When I worked with the user experience strategist on this project, they wanted the taxonomy at the you might also like at the bottom to be driven by taxonomy. Because of course, logically, you want to show other publications that are related to the one that you're on. So we got the dump of the database from the current site and migrated all that content in. And we found that the taxonomy on this just was not robust enough to support that. So if we had moved ahead with that idea and told the client, don't worry about it, it's just going to work, we would have been really let down when we dug into the content types and the taxonomy that were actually available and found that it couldn't support it. So instead, we went to the client with this, showed it to them, and made a recommendation to use node reference to pull out the publications they really wanted to feature. And they actually loved it. That was what they wanted to do because the publications that are related to each other might not be intuitive at first. So long term, we can replace that with something that might be based on what other people ordered from the site or based on a more robust taxonomy. But in the short term for launch, this is a really great conversation to have. The reason why we've been so passionate about this approach is that as we've implemented it at Rock Creek, we've had a fair amount of success stories with it, and we found it's really put our process ahead of where it would be otherwise. So here are some of those.
All right, so this is a current site for the Commission of the Fine Arts, a government agency that goes and approves the design and development of different structures, public art sculptures, buildings in and around the nation's capital. So this is our current static site, and they had asked us, you know, can you help us redesign the site? And we'd like a dynamic site. So we were going to build this in Drupal, and it was really, they had a really hard time understanding how a static site works versus how a dynamic site works. So we ended up building this prototype to actually show them, you know, how their data can be reused and how the pages can be dynamically generated, and it would be a much easier lift on their end. So this is a prototype that we created for them, and we actually showed them how it could work responsively, and they really liked that. And they could understand that better than interpreting a lot of wireframes. And in terms of design, because they are a fine arts agency, we really wanted to push the envelope on the designs themselves of the homepage. And what was great is that everything was decided in terms of functionality and features with the prototype, that the designers could really focus on pushing that creative envelope. So we came up with 3 different design directions. So this first one has like a center hero image area that works as a carousel that has like a previous and next preview of the other images in the carousel. Another approach was a little bit more traditional, but it had at the bottom a thumbnail scrolling area that you can switch the images out. And the last design was actually the final design that they chose, which really had big pictures, and it organized the blocks a little bit differently. But as you can see, we can go in different design directions and still get the same functionality and features, and the designers didn't feel so tied to what we had created in the prototype. Another case study is Education Pioneers, an organization based out in Oakland, California. And they had asked us to redo their site, and they wanted it dynamic as well as responsive. And for us, this was great because this was originally on a 9-month timeline, which was already short, but it got compressed to 6 months. So the fact that we could build the prototype and start throwing in content was really helpful because that helped speed our process along. And this was great because it actually showed the client how dynamic their content was going to be and where certain elements were going to be brought up on other pages.
So this one's the Federal Trade Commission, which I've shown a couple snippets of previously already. This is the site that they started out with. It's a static site. It had a grand total of about 150,000 assets on the site, ranging from HTML to PDF, document. I could go on. And it had been static for a long time, and people had some trouble understanding how it was going to translate. It also has a pretty confusing information architecture going on up there, where things are organized by the Bureau of the FTC rather than by how people might be more likely to look for content. So we'd put together that HTML prototype initially that showed our new IA and kind of some of the new interactions we were planning on presenting here. And we wound up with this site, ftc.gov, that launched in December. The reason I'm still talking about it as a Drupal prototyping success story, despite the fact that we did an HTML prototype for it, is that what allowed this to be a successful engagement was the prototyping the entire way through the process. As soon as we managed to build out the basic theming and the basic development, we got the client into a staging site and started prototyping little interactions that were not big enough to be included in our wireframes. So there was a database of information that got pulled from a third-party source and migrated in here and had its own searching and filtering mechanisms and would have taken ages to wireframe out. But getting key people in a room, showing it to them and explaining what our vision was and talking to them about how their content was going to support it, we got faster feedback and we were more able to iterate on it. The great thing about this is that it allows you to do small, light revision rounds with them and kind of get people in a room, get reactions, get feedback by the end of the day, and go from there rather than having lengthy rounds where people are trying to understand this kind of paper wireframing process. So the benefits of the collaborative sketching and digital prototyping process for us have been 4 major ones. The first is that it allows you to navigate challenges early, such as the you might also like issue that I mentioned earlier. We have to get it on the screen, and rather than just throwing it on the screen with HTML or with OmniGraffle, we're actually taking the time to think about how those data connections are going to get made and plan around them, which produces a better product early at this phase and forces you to question some of your assumptions. The second way it's been really helpful is getting buy-in from our team. Even if not every person in the room is going to sketch every page, everyone is benefiting from this kind of collective knowledge that's getting generated early in the process. And when it comes time for the designer to do the designs, they know what's going on and why. Your content strategist understands ultimately what's going to be done with what they're putting together, and your UXer gets the benefit of your developer's technical knowledge as well as the technical knowledge of everyone else on your team. It gets better buy-in from the client because they're not trying to interpret annotations and ask you what you meant by double tap but what reactions am I realistically going to see when I put in these taxonomy terms as a filter? Instead, they put in the taxonomy term in the filter and hit search, and they pretty much see what they're going to get. This makes them a lot happier, and it makes you happier because you get to the benefit of that feedback really early in the process. Finally, you can do realistic usability testing as long as you have an adequate amount of information in the site. And people's reactions to this usability testing are going to be really similar to their reactions to the testing, to their reactions to the final site. There are some things to remember as you start implementing this process at your company, which I'll let Ms. Shell speak to.
All right, when implementing this, you want to start with a small project first. Like I said, it's more manageable, it's quicker to recover with. So that could be like a small website, or it could even be like a small portion of a bigger website. You also want to keep communication open. So this is a very collaborative process. That means you're going to be talking to a lot of people, and more often than you're probably used to. So that might mean I'm running into Kat's office to answer some questions, or she's coming to my desk, or we're talking to the designer, or having working sessions. So maybe like I'm in a room working on some, smaller fine-tuned UX functionality while Kat's coding. And also get new staff involved early. So this is a good cultural shift in terms of the way you do stuff at your company. And so when we first did this activity, we pulled all the team members in for that one project, but we also pulled in a couple other people to experiment and get the feel for what this process is like so they can try it out on their new projects. And the biggest thing to remember is that this is a process. So you're going to be iterating upon it. When we first started it, I didn't provide any background information on the users because I was afraid that was going to limit the creativity of the sketching sessions. But then I found out that people really needed that background information as to who their users are. So just be iterative, also be adaptable. And that could be anything from something small like someone doesn't want to sketch in markers, they want to use pencils. Sure, go ahead. But that also could mean something bigger, as in like, okay, we didn't sketch, get enough time to sketch. We're going to add an additional sketching session, and that might push the timeline a little bit. So that's the biggest takeaway, is just being adaptable to getting this process on board, and that's how you can really get it to take off at your company.
Okay, so thanks a lot. That's our presentation, and we have about 15 minutes for questions if anyone has any.
What type of buy-in do you get from the client before you go to the prototyping phase? Are they looking at your sketches and approving those beforehand?
So often not. There's a variation. The CFA, Commission of Fine Arts prototype that we showed, they actually didn't see anything before we went to the prototype phase. We went directly from sketching internally to showing them the prototype. And we did that because we had a really, really clear idea of their goals and the major elements they wanted on the page. Oftentimes that is not how it works. As I mentioned, we use wireframes sometimes for small, high conflict pages like the home page. So on some of our recent contracts, we'll do a wireframe for just the home page and the interior page and limit those revision rounds. So as soon as we have a good sense of where the client wants to go, we start making those changes actually in that prototype process. But generally, you don't want to go into a prototype and have built out some 100 pages of content and then have them say, oh, yeah, we're getting rid of that section. So it's a good idea to make sure you're on the same page first.
I have a lot of clients that can look at a wireframe and get the vision, and then I have those clients that it scares the hell out of them. Because they're so visually focused on that picture that once I show them an actual comp, they think that that's what their site's going to look like. How do you overcome that visual block that some clients have in looking at a prototype, which is obviously have very minimal design to it?
Yeah, a lot of it's just setting good client expectations from the very beginning. And so a lot of times what we'll do is that we'll show them actual, this is the FTC prototype that we did, and this is what the site looks like. And they're like, oh, okay, I get it. Or just trying to use analogies in ways that they would understand. So we talk about prototype, especially with the Commission of Fine Arts, they're all architects. So we would just tell them, it's kind of like a blueprint, and then your site will go into it. So using analogies is really helpful, or just showing past examples, even if you have to mock up a prototype or find something on the internet to show them, this is what it is and this is what it turns into, and setting those expectations.
I think so. We did try. What we had done is we'd gotten lucky by doing that HTML prototype I referenced that was in HTML form, and to the client it doesn't really matter if it's in Drupal or if it's in HTML form, so that helped. But this is the Commission of Fine Arts one, which I arrowed back through about 300 slides to get to, because it was helpful to show them this because it clearly does not look like a website. There was no chance they were going to think that we were actually going to put a giant gray empty thing on their homepage. So we stressed that as much as possible. But I think Michelle's right. The biggest thing that we were able to do was say, here's where we started and here's where we ended up. So if you really want to do this, but you don't have a lot of examples to work from, it's not a terrible idea to have a front-end developer do a really quick HTML prototype of just your homepage wire and your interior wire from a previous project, so that you can say, here's an example of a prototype, what it looks like anyway, and here's an example of the website. There is a huge gap between the two, so don't think this is what you're going to end up with. And that's actually exactly what we did for CFA. Here.
Have you ever had a client, after you presented them the prototype at some point in the process, actually change, want to change direction? We start over again, maybe major revisions?
Clients changing their mind? That never happens. We have had clients want to make revisions. One thing that has been helpful is having, I think that oftentimes when clients make revisions, sometimes there are people who just at the 11th hour say, wait, what if I added this section instead? But really often clients are making that big about face because they didn't understand what they approved in the first place. And we found the prototype drastically decreases the occurrences of that happening, because if we have an issue early, we sit down again with our development team, our content migrators, our UXers, and talk through it and say, this could end up being an issue for the following reasons, but the client really, really wants it, and we'll talk about how to present it to them. I know with certain clients, I've gone in and said, just so you understand, doing it this way means that you are going to lose the ability to edit this area of your content. Is that what you want? Or doing it this way means that this section is going to have a lot less visibility. Are you sure that's what you want? And not being afraid to have that, are you sure it's what you want conversation really cuts down on the, oh crap, we have to change it conversation later. It's not perfect, and yeah, there are people who are going to change things, but the more that you've gone through it and you have a reasonable understanding of where both of you are in the process, both the contractor and the client, the better chance you have of it going off successfully. I think there was one over here.
Yeah, just curious if you guys have any experience with using like hotspot prototypes, where you basically take the sketch and then you turn it into something that's just clickable from the sketch to get to your clickable prototype faster than necessarily doing it.
We did actually do that at one point. In our version, it was like a kind of PDF prototypes that were very, very hotspotty. I've never actually heard it called that, so I'm going to have to file that away in my vocabulary. But we found that it didn't work well for us, for the clients we were working with at the time, because it's so unlike a website. If you can only follow the path that's laid out for you in that PDF. So if they say, oh, but I want to click this, they can't. And that doesn't, if you have a really, really thorough sketching process and you have a lot for them to move through, it wouldn't be as much of an issue. But we had issues with it for that reason.
So tools like Envision app, and I'm trying to think of another one. Zerv's got another competitor, but what I like about that is you can actually iterate through. You could take a sketch, you can make it clickable essentially, and then you can make a wireframe of the same sketch and just basically overwrite the sketch, and then you can make it more high fidelity. You can kind of make it more. You can move through that process, and it allows you to do also inline commenting. So you can comment on things that are specific to the page, which you can't really do. I haven't seen in a Drupal prototype yet, which I find is helpful, especially when you have remote clients. You can't sit down with them and say, what is it you like? So.
Definitely. I think that could be useful for a lot of clients. On our side, what we tend to do is if we can't sit down with them, we will actually display it remotely and kind of collect their feedback via notes, but it's not them making inline comments like you're describing. And I think that would be really interesting to look into, because we want to be able to reuse this later. It kind of depends on what your goals are as a team. And if you want quick sign-off, that would be a great way to do it. Someone over here?
Prototype on screen is one of the ways that clients can look at these and not have the whole concept. One of the big concepts behind this kind of prototyping is you're removing design from the interaction with the client so they can focus on what really matters. So you get a lot less distraction with color choices, which always mask bad interactions, or textures or things that they didn't, it became personal taste that was blinding them to the content. So you end up with, when you do get feedback from a client, when you're just showing them gray boxes and pink type or whatever the case may be, you get good feedback because they're not distracted by elements that are more fun to make comments on.
Definitely. We actually took out of this prototype in particular, the original version of these images was from placeholder.it. I can never remember the name of that one. And it had like the numbers across it, like 657 by 239. That's a totally made up number. And we found that even that, we just had to go back and take it out because they fixated even on that. So we stripped out anything visual that we could do. Any other questions? Okay, cool. Thank you guys very much for your time.